I stood in front of a statue called the Charioteer. It's a Greek statue, it's in Delphi. Tall. And it was 500 BC. It made me cry. And I thought, boy, that's what an architect should do.
I think somebody said, and I think it was right, that when you are 8, 9 years old, you already have got everything you need in the life. You know, you have been trapping under the skin the essence of your identity. And this is not the romantic idea. So it's quite true. I think it's quite true. The truth is that at that age, when you live your local world very intensively, when it's so intense, when desire are so intense, they remain. And so that local becomes your universal. It's no more local. It's your identity that you keep with you. And then, of course, you keep growing. I'm not a psychologist, you know, but, you know, I think that this is what happened. When then you are 18, 19, then there are different values that come over. And the different values are what we normally call cultural value and social. There are two different things that come to help. And also invention. And also invention. You start to wash your hands. You do something. You start to watch and you say, oh my God, I made it, you know? You find this mysterious thing that is creativity. And this is not normally when you are 9, 10, 11. It's more like when you are 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So invention, the pleasure of discovery, the pleasure of understanding the beauty and the excellence of the world that is around you, historical, architecture and culture and painting and art and music. That's great. And equally great is understanding that society is a very interesting thing, community. So you understand the value of talking to people, listening to people, understanding people, discussing with people, and exchanging with people. Those values come a bit later, and of course they shape you, for sure, because I remember when I was a student in Milan, and I was, what, 22, 23, 24 years old, this is when you start to wonder about the city. You walk in the street, you talk to people, you discover the sky, you discover rivers, forests, sea, the vastity of the world. So there are so many things that come to make you, and friends, and crossing frontiers. So that you start a friend that are not necessarily doing the same thing you are doing. You start to know friends that writers, or poets, or musicians, or I don't know what else, filmmakers, or photographers. And then you start to mix in this beautiful bouillabaisse that is creativity and art and beauty. You start to mix everything. So it's just so difficult to judge what has been most important in all this. The childhood, the teenage, or when you start to become a more civic person, so you start to understand the value. One thing is for sure, that architecture is everything coming together.
There was nothing in my background. I studied math and physics. I loved physics and chemistry in high school. And I also did wood shop, so I made things in the wood shop. I went to different schools looking at what they did, and they had books in my high school of what an architect does, whatever. And it also had a book on the schools where they teach and what kind of, and so architecture in those books in Toronto, Canada, where I was, were boring because they were about doing little cottages. And that didn't interest me, so I just closed the book. I became interested in chemical engineering. I had a cousin who was a chemical engineer, so I thought maybe I'd be interested in that. I went to a laboratory with the guy that took me, and it was, I couldn't stand it. They were doing the same tests 100 times to gauge the paint for a paint company. When I was a kid, my mother took me to an art museum, and I was always interested in that. And she also took me to classical concerts. And I was always interested. So all my life, I followed that. I came out to LA from Canada. We were very poor. I was a truck driver. It's an old story. I'm tired of saying it, but I took a night class I took several night classes at USC and at LA City College. In City College, I took calculus, and one of the classes I took was in perspective. I don't know why I took that. And I got an F. I failed. And I got very angry, and so I went back and took it again. And I got an A. So there was something compelling about that. I took a class in ceramics, and the teacher was building a house by an architect. He had invited me to come look at his house under construction. He had a sense of something. So I went, and after that meeting, he enrolled me in the architecture school night class. He said, "Why don't you try this? It may be interesting to you." Well, I did really well, and they put me in second year, and so I was off. It was all by chance. I mean.
My father was a politician and an economist, but my mother was very interested in interiors and architecture, and I don't know why. I remember, I think that there must have been an exhibition in Baghdad, and I think I was very young. I don't remember it very well. And I think it was then that I became more and more interested in architecture. But you know, you're a kid, you don't know why you like certain things. Because I mean, my parents encouraged me to do architecture, but in a way I thought it was too tough, you know, like it was going to be a nightmare. And math was a relatively easy subject for me. So when I went to Beirut, I could have done either to the School of Architecture, and I only wanted to spend 3 years there. It was a very useful thing to study, actually, because it organized your thinking, more than just like knowing how to add things or arithmetic or whatever. But I think my interest in geometry obviously remains till this day. So that was the aspect of architecture which you know, of math I like. Geometry, trigonometry, all these things. But geometry also influenced me a great deal.
And I'd always been interested in things, locomotives. I would stand for hours waiting for a locomotive to pass. And there were special locomotives with nameplates, and there were just goods trains, and you waited patiently for the really special ones. And cars have always had an attraction. And artists. When I was a child in Manchester, I was aware of Lowry, for example. Whether it's weekly magazines like Eagle with cutaway drawings which reveal the inner workings of the all the things that move and have a dynamic. So perhaps all the things that excited the Italian futurists at the beginning of the century, and which in many ways have also inspired other architects. Le Corbusier, for example, had a romance with flying machines and devoted a book to it. And it was one of his books that I discovered in my local lending library, that Towards a New Architecture. But it was the juxtaposition of classical architecture with fast hydroplanes and so on. So as a child, I remember sketching, and I remember being enthused and excited by these machines and speed. The books were really of another, more glamorous world. I've mentioned Towards a New Architecture, but it could be In the Nature of Materials, Henry Russell Hitchcock, or later it could be 1950s copies of the Architectural Review showing the landscapes of Bela Marx in South America, Niemeyer, and works in Scandinavia at the time. So running through this, even though my workplace was far removed from the world of architecture in Manchester Town Hall, because I left school at 16, and then I did national service for 2 years. So really running as a thread through all of these different things was my own private world of sketching, dreaming, enthusing, being excited by all the things outside my workplace.
Started out being interested in things like philosophy. I majored in philosophy at Harvard, and I didn't know it. I wanted to be a teacher or a theoretician or just what. But I was always interested in art and architecture to look at. And my mother was interested in architecture. She wanted a house by Frank Lloyd Wright when she was young. But father didn't see the same way, naturally, for obvious reasons. So we compromised by not having one. And I suddenly realized in the middle of my political work, ran for the local state legislature, and didn't want that and didn't work at all. I was a lousy politician, terrible. I had stage fright, everything wrong. I was sort of like certain, candidates for mayor in New York, but we won't go into lots of things. And so I said, well, obviously I missed my calling. So at the age of 34, I decided to really be serious about architecture. So I went to Harvard at 34. You see, my problem always was I couldn't draw. So I knew I couldn't be an architect, you see. Well, Harvard didn't care whether I could draw or not. It seemed like a good idea. And by that time, I'd worked for some years at the Museum of Modern Art on architecture. So I decided, what the hell, I might as well be one.
The reason I became an architect was Soviet architecture. I came to Moscow for the first time in '67.
Yeah.
And I was unaware of the kind of history of Soviet architecture. I was unaware of the kind of avant-garde of the 20s, and kind of suddenly I became aware of a kind of really radical interpretation of architecture, constructivism, that was related to Malevich and to architects like Leonidov, that really reinvented daily life from scratch. And so therefore, from the beginning, I was less interested in form, but in the role of architecture in helping to define daily life that really triggered me. And at the time, I was also a scriptwriter, so it was a discovery that architecture is actually also a form of scriptwriting that made it possible
a form of scriptwriting.
Scriptwriting, yeah.
Wow.
Because for an architect says, okay, this is the living room, kind of here is the staircase, and there the kitchen. So implicitly, you actually describe a scene or you describe a relationship.
Yeah.
So that made it kind of very easy switch.
Well, fortunately, I never had to decide. It was decided for me before I was born. My mother was a teacher, and she wanted an architect for a son. I happened to be the son, and of course, naturally, an architect. I was conditioned by her. The room into which I was born was hung with the wood engravings of the English cathedrals made by Timothy Cole. You remember those? So I was born into architecture.